Welcome to English with Zenko Master. Get ready to learn something new today.
My name is Marissa. I'm 32 years old, and I live in a small town near Porto, Portugal. It's a quiet place with stone houses, narrow roads, and people who talk more than they listen. I've lived here my whole life. I teach English at the local secondary school. Most days are simple. I wake up early, drink strong coffee, catch the bus, and walk into a classroom filled with loud teenagers who never seem to run out of energy. But no one really knows me. They see a quiet woman who smiles politely and rarely speaks unless spoken to. They think calmness means weakness, that silence is equal to fear. I've heard it all before. She's too soft. She lets people walk over her. Does she even feel anything? They whisper these things like I can't hear them, but I hear everything. I just don't always respond. Not because I'm afraid, but because I learned the cost of reacting too quickly, too loudly, too emotionally. I learned it the hard way. It started 5 years ago on a rainy November afternoon. I was in the teacher's lounge, sitting alone with a sandwich and a book, when I overheard something that changed everything. 2 colleagues, Anna and Jorge, were talking about a student who had failed his exams. I wasn't paying attention until I heard my name. "It's Marissa's fault," Anna said. "She's too passive. She doesn't push them hard enough." Jorge agreed without hesitation. "She's nice, but that doesn't help these kids." I froze. My hands trembled slightly, but I kept my head down. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the book and say, "Do you even know how much I care about these students? Do you know how many hours I spend trying to help them succeed?" But I said nothing. I left the room quietly, went back to class, and taught the next lesson as if nothing had happened. That night, I sat in bed staring at the ceiling. Their words echoed in my head. I wasn't angry because they judged me. I was hurt because they misunderstood me. They saw calm as weakness. But what they didn't know was that I used to be the opposite. I used to react to everything. Years ago, when I first started teaching, I had fire in my voice. I would raise my voice at rude students. I would argue with colleagues. I once sent an angry email to a parent who questioned my teaching. I always thought that standing up for myself meant speaking loudly, defending every move. But each time I reacted, I lost something. I lost respect. I lost peace. I lost myself. The worst moment came during a staff meeting. The principal criticized my lesson plans, saying they lacked structure. I was so offended that I stood up and defended myself in front of everyone. My voice shook, my heart pounded, and my words came out sharp. Later, I learned that most of the staff saw me as emotional and difficult to work with. One reaction cost me years of trust. So I changed. Slowly. Quietly. I trained myself to pause. To breathe. To observe before I speak. I read books on emotional control. I started meditating before work. I stopped replying to every message immediately. I learned the strength of silence. But silence, I found, is often misunderstood. A few weeks after Anna and Jorge's conversation, the school received a new student. Her name was Layla. She was 15, tall, and always wore oversized hoodies. She didn't speak much, and when she did, her voice was barely a whisper. Other students made fun of her. Teachers called her difficult and disconnected. I saw myself in her. One day during lunch, I found Layla sitting alone behind the library. Her eyes were red and her hands were clenched. I sat beside her without speaking. After a few minutes, I offered her a piece of my sandwich. She didn't take it, but she looked at me and said, "Why don't you talk much, miss?" I smiled softly. Sometimes silence speaks louder. She nodded. I didn't ask her any questions. I just sat there. That was the beginning of something. She started attending my classes more regularly. Slowly, she began answering questions. I never forced her. I simply gave her space. Space to feel safe. Space to grow. But of course, not everyone saw it that way. One afternoon, I was called into the principal's office. He looked serious. "There's been a complaint," he said. "Some teachers feel you're too emotionally distant with the students, that you don't engage enough." I felt a familiar pain rise in my chest. Not this again, I thought. I took a breath and said, "Have you spoken to the students?" He paused. "No, but the feedback came from staff." I nodded slowly. Sometimes the quietest teacher sees the most. Just because I'm not loud doesn't mean I'm not present. He didn't respond, just thanked me and let me go. I walked home that day with my coat pulled tight against the wind. The streets were wet and the sky was dark. I felt small again. I felt judged again. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't text anyone for comfort. I made tea, sat on the sofa, and closed my eyes. I reminded myself of something my grandmother once told me. She said, "The river never shouts, but it shapes the land." That evening, I wrote in my journal. I wrote about Layla, about Anna and Jorge, about the principal, and I wrote this sentence: "I would rather be misunderstood in peace than accepted in noise." The next week, something unexpected happened. Layla stayed after class. She handed me a folded piece of paper and quickly walked out. I opened it. It said, "Dear Miss Marissa, I know people think you don't care, but I see it. In your eyes. In how you never rush me. In how you sit beside me without words. You made me feel safe for the first time in a long time. Thank you for your silence. Layla." I read it twice, then a third time. My hands trembled. Not from anger this time, but from something deeper. From knowing that even if the whole world misunderstood me, this one girl didn't. And maybe that was enough. Before I share the rest of my story, could you please tell me where you're from? It gives me strength to know there's someone out there who listens to me, who understands me. It means a lot to me. The next few days passed quietly, but something inside me had changed. Layla's letter stayed in my wallet, folded and warm from being close to my body. I read it every morning before school and every night before bed. That simple note reminded me that someone had seen me, truly seen me, and understood what others could not. Her words were few, but they held more value than 100 conversations with people who only saw my silence as emptiness. For the first time in months, I walked into school with a sense of quiet strength. I still smiled gently, still listened more than I spoke, but my silence now felt full instead of hollow. It didn't take long for life to test that strength. On a cold Tuesday morning, I walked into my classroom and found graffiti across the whiteboard. In black marker, someone had written, "Miss Mouse. Too quiet to teach." The room was still empty. The students had not arrived yet. I stared at the words for a long moment. I felt a sharp twist in my stomach, like a knife pressing against old wounds. I could guess who had written it, but proving it would only bring more trouble. I took a deep breath, wiped it clean, and started preparing for class. When the students arrived, I taught as usual. I did not mention what had happened. Some of them looked confused, maybe even guilty, but I gave them nothing to fight against, only calmness. Later that day, during lunch, one of the younger teachers, Carla, sat beside me. She was new and still full of excitement and nervous energy. She leaned closer and said, "I saw what was on your board this morning. That was awful. Why didn't you say anything?" I looked at her and gave a small smile. Because if I start fighting every small battle, I'll lose the strength to fight the big ones. She looked at me as if she didn't fully understand, but nodded respectfully. Not everyone would get it, and that was okay. The truth is, I had spent so many years trying to be understood by people who didn't want to understand. I had wasted energy defending myself to those who had already made up their minds. But I was learning that peace doesn't come from being accepted. It comes from accepting yourself, even when others refuse to see you clearly. On Thursday, Tomas, the boy who had stormed out the week before, surprised me. He waited after class until the other students had left. Then he walked up to my desk and stood silently, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Finally, he said, "Miss, I shouldn't have shouted at you. I was just having a bad day." I nodded gently and replied, "I understand. Thank you for coming to tell me." He looked surprised that I didn't say more, but I could see the tension leaving his shoulders. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't need a lecture, just a moment of kindness. That moment healed something between us, something that could have broken if I had reacted in anger. But not everyone appreciated my quiet approach. On Friday, during our weekly staff meeting, Anna brought up the topic of classroom discipline. Without naming me, she said, "We need to make sure students know who's in charge. Some teachers let them walk all over them." A few teachers nodded. I felt their eyes move toward me, even if just for a second. My heart pounded, but I kept my face calm. The old version of me would have spoken up. I would have said something sharp, something smart. But I had learned that words spoken in defense rarely change minds already filled with judgment. So I stayed silent. After the meeting, Jorge approached me. "Don't listen to her," he said softly. "We see the way your students behave around you. They respect you in a different way." I smiled at him. "Thank you," I said, and meant it. Support doesn't always come loudly. Sometimes it's a quiet sentence from someone who's been watching carefully. That weekend, I took a long walk by the river that winds through our town. The path was muddy from the recent rain, but I didn't mind. The bare trees stood tall like skeletons of summer, and the wind carried the smell of earth and water. I let the silence wrap around me like a coat. Nature never demands. It just exists. Peacefully. That's what I wanted to be like. Not someone who needs to shout to be seen. Just someone who can stand quietly and still leave a mark. The following Monday, when I entered my classroom, something felt different. Layla's chair was still empty. I stared at it for a long time before beginning the lesson. As I passed by the desks, I noticed a folded piece of paper placed neatly on mine. I opened it and found handwriting I didn't recognize. It read, "Thank you for being the calm in our chaos." There was no name, just those simple words. My throat tightened. I looked around the room. Everyone was focused on their work, but I wondered who had left the note. It didn't matter. The message was clear. Even in my silence, something was reaching them. But then came the call. On Wednesday afternoon, the principal asked to see me. He didn't smile when I entered. "Marissa," he said, "I've received a few concerns from parents. They say you're too quiet in the classroom, that their children don't feel pushed." I sat still, listening carefully. "I understand," I said, "but I believe in giving space. I believe students grow when they feel safe, not when they feel pressure." He sighed. "I know you mean well, but some parents expect a different kind of teacher." I nodded slowly. Maybe what they expect and what their children need are not the same. He didn't argue, just told me he would monitor things more closely. I left the office with mixed feelings. I wasn't angry. I was tired. Tired of explaining myself to people who judged without knowing the full picture. But then I remembered Layla. I remembered Tomas and the note on my desk. And I reminded myself that I'm not here to impress everyone. I'm here to be a steady presence for those who need it. Even if the world misunderstands me, I must remain true to who I am. That night, I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea. The stars above me blinked softly, hidden behind thin clouds. I thought of all the moments I had held back tears, swallowed my words, walked away from fights. Not because I was weak, but because I wanted peace more than victory. That kind of strength is quiet. It doesn't shine in meetings or shout in hallways. It lives in silent moments, in kindness that asks for nothing in return, in calmness that refuses to be shaken. I picked up my journal and wrote, "They may never fully understand me, but I am no longer afraid of being misunderstood." That sentence stayed with me like a whisper at the back of my mind. And the next day, when another student arrived late and slammed his bag on the floor, I didn't flinch. I simply looked at him and said, "Take a breath, then join us when you're ready." He blinked, surprised, then nodded slowly. He sat down quietly. That was enough. I was learning to trust silence, to trust that stillness can be louder than anger, that kindness doesn't need applause, that the calm girl everyone misunderstood was no longer trying to be understood. She was just trying to be real. And in that truth, she found her strength. The final weeks of the school term arrived like slow-moving clouds, heavy, quiet, and full of things you could not quite name. I felt the weight of everything that had happened, the judgment, the whispers, the calm I had to hold so tightly. Some days, I walked through the halls like a shadow, unnoticed but always watching. Other days, I felt eyes on me, not with admiration, but with confusion, as if people still couldn't figure me out. I had accepted that a long time ago, but what I hadn't accepted was how lonely it sometimes felt to live this way. Being calm was peaceful, yes, but it also meant walking alone when others walked in loud groups. It was during one of these quiet walks between classes that Carla, the younger teacher, caught up to me. She looked nervous, like she had rehearsed what she wanted to say. "Marissa," she began, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day, about not fighting every small battle. I wanted to tell you something." She paused and looked down. "I've been having a hard time. With the students. With the pressure. I always thought I had to be loud to be respected. But watching you, I started wondering if I've been doing it all wrong." I stopped walking and looked at her carefully. She looked tired, like she had been carrying more than just lesson plans. I placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and said, "You're not doing it wrong. You're learning. Just like all of us." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She nodded and smiled. That small moment between us felt bigger than any staff meeting or evaluation. It was real. And it reminded me that even when you feel invisible, someone is always watching, learning from you, feeling your presence even when you say nothing. The last week of school was filled with noise and decorations. Students signed each other's notebooks. Teachers planned end-of-term parties. Music played in the hallways, and the air felt lighter. But I stayed the same. Calm, focused, present. My classroom was simple. No bright streamers or loud games, just soft music, warm tea, and space to reflect. Some students came and sat silently. Others wrote letters or journal entries. No one was forced to speak, but many did. One girl wrote, "This was the first classroom where I felt safe." Another boy said, "I used to think you were too quiet." But now I think you were just listening more than the rest." Those words stayed with me. They were soft, like a feather landing gently on my heart. But they meant everything. I had spent so long thinking I was doing everything wrong, simply because I didn't do things loudly. Now I saw it differently. Maybe being calm wasn't the easy way. Maybe it was the braver way. On the final day, as I packed up my things, I found a small gift on my desk. It was a bookmark made of thick paper, decorated with flowers and stars. On the back, in small handwriting, it said, "For the teacher who taught me that silence can be powerful too." I didn't need a signature to know who it was from. My chest felt tight, but not in a painful way. In a way that made me feel full, seen, and strong. That evening, I walked home slowly. The streets were quiet, the shops closing, the light golden and soft. I passed the little cafe where I often sat alone on Saturdays. The owner waved at me and I waved back. Everything looked the same, but something inside me had shifted. I was no longer walking through life trying to explain who I was. I was walking as myself, completely and quietly. At home, I lit a candle and sat near the window. I opened my journal and began to write. This time, the words came easily. I wrote about the things I had lost and the peace I had gained. I wrote about the power of not reacting, the strength it took to stay calm when every part of you wanted to fight. And I wrote something I never expected. I wrote, "Being misunderstood is not a failure. It is often a sign that you are living differently, and that difference is your gift." The months passed. A new school year began. New students, new names, new challenges. But I was no longer trying to change myself to fit into anyone else's idea of a good teacher. I wore my calmness like a second skin, not to hide behind, but to protect what mattered. My peace, my truth, my heart. One day, while reviewing homework, I saw a familiar name on a piece of paper. Layla. My heart jumped. It was a letter. It had been mailed to the school. She wrote that they had moved to Lisbon, that things were hard, but she was doing better, that she had made her first real friend. And then, at the end, she wrote, "Whenever I feel like I don't belong, I remember the way you sat next to me without trying to change me. That's when I feel strong again." I read the letter 3 times. I held it close. I let a few tears fall, and I didn't wipe them away quickly. I let them sit. They were not tears of sadness. They were tears of completion, of knowing that sometimes what you give to the world returns in quiet, beautiful ways. Not always when you expect it, but always when you need it most. In the years that followed, I was never the most popular teacher. I was never the one with the loudest class or the brightest decorations. But students came to me, slowly, silently, and they stayed. Not because I gave them all the answers, but because I gave them space to find their own. And every time someone called me too calm, I smiled inside, because I knew calmness is not emptiness. It is clarity. It is depth. It is the quiet fire that does not burn to destroy, but to warm. And even if the world never fully understood me, I had finally understood myself. I hope you have enjoyed the story. Like and comment if you want to hear more soon.